My career took off when I became a mother. I wasn't living as fully as I could when I was just living for myself. I think your family history matters, your religion matters, your culture matters, the story that you come from matters. The purchase of Twitter is one of the most important political, but also one of the most important technology acts probably in the history, not only the 21st century, but in the history of the internet. The minute where you strip yourself of all meaning, you just get filled with these platitudes. I do think that is why you saw sort of this progressive religion take off in wokeism, where people had no meaning anymore, and so they just adopted whatever the current thing was. Land a man on the moon or take a man to Mars. If you create a family who've done something that has a legacy that's the ultimate thing to build, if what you are looking for as an investor is truth and where the world is headed, I feel like I've had a better barometer in Florida than I did in Silicon Valley. Our limited partners, like no one wants to think that's how you're making decisions about investments, right? It sounds like a little bit woo-woo, right?
Welcome back to another episode of Invested. I am here with Katherine Boyle. The truth is, I have been waiting to do this for a very, very long time. I think you'll find out that despite our different genders and despite our different religions, we share a ton in common. And it's going to make this a super interesting conversation. Welcome, Katherine.
It's so great to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
Katherine, rather than me describing who you are, you want to give us your brief background?
Yeah, so I love that you start with the sort of self-description. And I know we're going to get into this, but everyone always starts with where they worked or what they do for a living. And, I'm an investor at Andreessen Horowitz, but I always like to start with the family. And I know family is something that matters deeply to you too. So I always say my story actually starts with my father's story. I always get the question of, well, how did you learn how to invest? I changed careers much later in life and became an investor. And I always say it started because my father was a Jesuit priest or in the Jesuits for 10 years. And right before he was ordained, he decided to leave the Jesuits for a very, very long story. This was in the late 40s, early 50s, because he wanted to become a physician. And at the time, Jesuits could become physicians. And I always say, like, my story actually begins there. Because if my father hadn't had the courage to leave after 10 years and change his entire life, I would not be sitting here. So I'm very grateful to my father for deciding that he was going to go a different path at his mid-30s. And it is the reason I am here today.
That's an amazing story. And today you are a partner at Andreessen Horowitz and part of the American Dynamism practice there. Do you want to tell us how that got started quickly?
Absolutely, yeah. So the kind of origin for that is I had spent 10 years in Washington before moving out to Silicon Valley. And I always say, I had lived around the world, and the worst culture shock I ever felt was moving to Silicon Valley from Washington. Because while Washington, innovation is aerospace, defense, national security, the things that touch all American citizens, in Silicon Valley, when I moved in 2014, those were sort of categories no one was investing in. It was all, social apps. It was all the digital world. There was no sort of commonality between Washington and what Silicon Valley was doing at the time. And so, I kind of came out with this sort of Washington sensibility of, well, are these categories that tech can invest in? Like, can we bring software into the Department of Defense? Can we invest in new ways in production aerospace? And started investing in those categories. In 2021, I joined Andreessen Horowitz with the view that we are going to be much more focused on these categories coming into the 2020s. COVID hit. It was still the height of COVID. People were really focused on the fact that we didn't have enough PPE. There was a homeschooling movement happening in the U.S. because schools were closed, and so there was sort of this view that the companies that are focused on the national interest were going to be much more important. And of course, we announced the practice in January 2022. 3 weeks later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think the world completely changed in terms of how founders, particularly in Silicon Valley, view their role of building technology. So the impetus for the American Dynamism practice is really recognizing that we need to start building in the physical world. We need to be working with governments and allied governments. And we really need to focus on these categories of innovation that touch all American citizens and our allies.
3 hours ago, boom, a video of Mark Zuckerberg appears. Like it was teed up for this podcast, in which number one, Zuck seemed to admit that the U.S. government was interfering and censoring content on Meta, Facebook, Instagram, etc. Kind of point one. Point two, he said, well, censorship is bad. And so I'm going to the Elon Musk model of Twitter of community nodes. And it was like a jaw drop moment. I'm a fan of the community nodes model. I wrote about that about a year ago. But to hear Zuck say it was like stunning. And the third thing he said, uh, which I thought was super interesting, was that foreign countries, particularly Europe and China, get this all wrong, and their content moderation teams are a mess. And actually, the fourth thing he said, which was another one, was we got to get the hell out of California and move our content moderation teams to Texas. And I want to dig into each one of these, but I just first want to get your thoughts and reaction to this.
So I think it's extraordinary. And I think the extraordinary one is actually it kind of comes at the very end, where he does say we're going to push back on foreign governments. We're going to push back on governments that say that they want to censor us. Facebook has sort of been in the center of that, not only in the US, but around the world in terms of harmful content and sort of trying to appease many different regimes to operate. And I think the sort of broad takeaway is, elections have consequences. Like I think if people ever doubted that their vote matters, this is why your vote matters. Your vote matters because like the elect if the election had gone the other way, I don't know that Mark Zuckerberg would have come out and made that statement. I don't know
Meaning
that
you
he would
think
have.
he wouldn't have?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if it would have said something about the sentiment of the country, it also would have said something about who's going to, the sort of political actors. I mean, he actually names in that statement. He says it has been very difficult to work with the Biden administration on these things because they have a more pro-censorious view. So I think in some ways Americans should look at that and say, okay, my vote does matter. But I also think that it shows the impact of, again, the purchase of Twitter is one of the most important political, but also one of the most important technology acts probably in the history of, not only the 21st century, but in the history of the internet.
Agree.
It
Cultural
completely
too.
broke,
Yeah.
it completely broke the cycle of censorship. And had Elon had Elon not done that, I think the world would be a very different place. The sort of, again, where I keep on saying, like, I feel like if we were having this conversation 2 years ago, talking about moving to Florida and sort of escaping would have been much more, much more, kind of, I don't know, of the moment, because we did have this sort of massive pendulum swing back, people saying they're sick of it. And I think that is what Mark Zuckerberg is responding to. I think it is courageous of him. Courage is contagious. But I also think it would not have happened had Elon not done the same thing. And that to me says we need to speak out more. We need to be louder. We need to be talking more about these things. We need to be less afraid and kind of, speaking in euphemisms about why freedom of speech is so important.
So I need to ask you, you said it was courageous of him, but in the same sentence you said, I don't think he would have done it had the administration not changed, and he didn't do it before today. Do you think he's actually courageous, or do you think he's kind of sees the way the winds are blowing?
I mean, I think it is important, and I think he's reading the room, but I also think it does take it does take a person who understands that there's going to be a lot of backlash, especially on the foreign government aspect. Like there's going to be, I'm sure there's going to be business ramifications for what he says. There's going to be countries that don't agree with what he's saying. So I do think it takes a level of courage to do it. But again, it's like we are all indebted to Elon buying Twitter. And recognizing the importance of opening that platform up, given what had happened in 2020.
Let me let, me-
And
let me take let me posit two things for you. I'll do them one at a time just to get your reaction. Um, Over the last 5 days, Elon has exposed Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, and put him on his heels because of the grooming or the rape scandal in the UK. That's a wokish Labour government that's gone away. The AfD is ascending in Germany. By the way, Elon is interviewing the leader of that party this Friday. Um, Very clearly, Austria is moving in a similar direction, and so perhaps the cost to Zuckerberg to taking on Europe is actually lower because of the last 5 days and Elon's activities than it would have been before that.
yeah, no, it's definitely lower than, yeah. I mean, the world has shifted so much since the election. And really, like, I think there's a couple key moments where the world completely shifted, right? It's Elon buying Twitter, And then, we talk about sort of these mimetic cascades or these preference cascades that happen in society when people follow someone because they see one person speaking out and then they feel comfortable speaking out. And that certainly happened. I remember where I was sitting when the president was shot, in July. And that sort of moment of Elon saying, I'm supporting the president, and the number of people in Silicon Valley who had not spoken publicly about what about their preference or their view of the election, coming out and saying, I'm supporting, President Trump, or saying, like basically it was a freeing moment, that preference cascade where people felt like they could no longer remain silent. And I think you're just going to see more and more of that. Like to think that was only around 6 months ago. So we are sort of coming out of this sort of, I would say long period, like very, very long period where people have not practiced speaking what they believe. They still tiptoe around issues because they're not sure who's friend, who's foe. They don't want to lose their job. It's actually very recent when you look at it from a historical context of people being able to do this. So I think it matters that Mark Zuckerberg's doing it, because I think the rest of the CEOs who will look at him, maybe they look at Elon and they say, well, Elon can do it because he's the richest man in the world, but I can't do it. They look at Mark doing it and now they're like, okay, now I can do it.
Okay, he's the
Uh,
sixth richest man in the world.
yeah, well, and he's but
Whatever.
he's a lot more cautious, right? Like,
Yeah,
he's
he
always been
is.
more cautious. So there's something about that where I do think the more people that can speak, can be loud, can actually say what's going on and can push back, it gives courage to the people who are sort of in the middle, who are just going about their business. And maybe it gives courage to people who are not even in tech. Maybe it gives courage to the people who work in banking or in finance or in other industries where it's okay, like this is now a totally normal thing to say. So I think we're just seeing the beginning of sort of the unraveling, of the censoriousness that we've seen for really what has been, over a decade.
You went from Washington to Silicon Valley, but you don't live in Silicon Valley anymore. You live in Florida,
Yes.
and you're prosecuting this practice neither from Silicon Valley nor from like south of Los Angeles, where a lot of the space stuff and
Yes.
new manufacturing stuff is, nor from Washington. Why
Yes.
Florida?
It
Maybe now you're near Mar-a-Lago, but
Yeah. No, it's a great question, although it's looking a little bit more prescient now than it was in 2021. But why Florida? I think it is such a big question. I always say the greatest political act that I have ever participated in my life was leaving Silicon Valley and moving to Florida the minute that Mayor Suarez, tweeted out, "How can I help?" When it was the height of COVID lockdowns, there was sort of this, "Can we build Silicon Valley somewhere else?" The mayor responded. I saw that tweet. I was already in Florida, actually. What's really interesting about that story was I was expecting my first son. Gavin Newsom had put a very large lockdown, curfew, on cities across California, and said, like after a certain time, you can't leave your house. And I'm like, how am I going to get to the hospital? So I was a temporary move for us. I moved in with my mother and said, okay, we'll move back to San Francisco when things get normal again. Of course, that's never happened. So we serendipitously are here still in Florida. But in some ways, I think, there's been a lot of talk about politics in Silicon Valley, but political action matters just as much as political talk. And I think moving to a place where you are surrounded by people that have your values, where you are focused on, I'd say, the things that matter most to you and your family. I'm much more in line with sort of the values of Florida than I am with the values of San Francisco. And so our family decided, like, we are going to put down roots in Florida. We're surrounded by people here who share kind of what we think matters most in life. And I think more and more people should do that. And the exciting thing about where I think technology is headed is that it is going to be, I think we're at the beginning of a 20, 30-year trend where people are actually going to be able to make those moves. And you look at the migration patterns that are happening in Texas and Florida, and states in the Sun Belt in the US. It's extraordinary the number of people who are saying, I want to be around people who are like me, who share my values, and they're moving to states that otherwise didn't have that migration 5 years ago.
the topic of this podcast is how values create value, right? This is where we start and how your values create an investment strategy. So could you be more specific about what those values are that you found in Florida or South Florida that you did not find in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'd say the first thing that I've noticed when I moved to Florida, was how proud people are to be American, how excited people are to be in this country. So you see it in Miami. There's American flags on every Uber. People are enthusiastic. The city of Miami actually celebrates an anti-communism day where they like talk about the evils of communism. And part of the reason for that is the migration. Like there's a massive Cuban population that understands just how detrimental and the tyranny that exists under a communist regime in Cuba. But I also think it is sort of this Floridian spirit, which I didn't understand. I grew up in northern Florida, and I don't think I understood this until I came back. But it really is sort of a frontier-like spirit where it's everyone is doing these weird things. People are not necessarily, just focused on their jobs. People are building families. They want to experiment in different ways. In some ways, it has sort of the what California was in the 50s, sort of this newness, this freshness. I'm coming here for a better life. Everyone who was in Florida, Florida's a very young state in terms of the migration that's happened in the 20th century. People who are here, they're coming here because they want opportunity. And I do feel like there is sort of this opportunity spirit that exists in Miami, but also in Greater Florida, where people have moved here for different reasons. So for some people, we meet a lot of young families who moved here because they want more space. They didn't like where they were living before. They didn't like the values that were being preached to them in public schools or in many private schools in New York City, for example. And so they moved their families down here because they didn't agree with sort of the dogma that was happening in whatever community they were in before. But you see just a ton of different reasons why people have moved here. And it's all, whether it's economic opportunity, whether it's escaping communism, whether it's escaping dogmatic practices in schools, whatever it is, they're here for opportunity because they care about their family. And that is something that has just always been sort of top of mind for me and how people live their life, where at least where I am. And that's why I think we love it here so much.
Yeah, I think you're alluding to when you speak about people moving their kids out of the private schools in New York, for example, the kind of progressive woke culture that's taken over a lot of those places. Is that a fair statement?
I do think we've seen a movement away from that wokeism that's very public from both our companies, our political leaders. We just had an election, so in some ways, it's we are seeing the tides turn on that. But I do think that the past 4 years, why I moved, why many of my neighbors moved, was this tyrannical view that you have to abide by the dogma of progressivism versus the dogmas that you might believe in because of a religious practice or because of a family tradition. And so I think that is something that I think unites a lot of Floridians is just the freedom that we feel living here.
When I was a kid, the only people who moved down to South Florida were older Jewish couples seeking warm weather.
Yes.
So when I saw people leave New York to go to Florida, it was because they were 65, retired, and probably moving on to play golf and stay out of the cold in New York.
Yes.
And I think Mayor Suarez of Miami, a mutual friend of both of ours, an incredible American, an incredible person. When he reached out, there was an initial tidal wave, but it feels like a lot of people have actually gone back to San Francisco since then. Is that an incorrect impression?
So I think some have. It's interesting. I think the Florida migration, at least the way I was seeing it was a lot more. It was more people from New York, right? Because it's like New York is a day trip. Washington D.C. is a day trip from South Florida. So I think there were a lot of people who moved from New York City and they've stayed because why you can fly up in a day if you need to. Why would you move back? I do think it is a different culture and it is a culture shock coming from California where, San Francisco is the, tech universe for the world. And so if you are investing in AI, if you are investing in companies that are being built in San Francisco, it makes sense to be in San Francisco. I certainly, I think there was a lot of talk in 2021 of was Miami going to be the new tech hub? I don't think that's why Florida is an interesting experiment. I actually think Florida is an interesting political experiment. And that matters just as much for the future of this country as does having new economic zones. I do think that Florida and Texas in particular are the, kind of the political petri dishes for the country and for federalism. But if you're investing in AI, you need to be in San Francisco. If you're focused on companies that are in San Francisco. But for categories that are outside of AI in particular, we're investing in American Dynamism and a lot of companies that are being built in the physical world. And there isn't really a nexus of where those companies are
Hmm.
being built. We have companies in Texas and Southern California. Southern California is becoming sort of that hub, but Washington, D.C., Atlanta, I mean, there's companies all over the country that are being built in American Dynamism, and that's also why it's super exciting that the innovation isn't just being kind of hoarded in a couple states or cities.
You mentioned a couple of times in passing this notion of family, and it sounded like you didn't find what I would call family values in the Bay Area, and that kind of caused your move to Florida. Yeah, what specifically troubled you in San Francisco and caused you to move here? That's kind of question one. And question two, we're doing this on Riverside here. You've said in the past that Zoom is good for raising a family. And so I'd
Yes.
love to have that discussion because, like, I'm in the anti-Zoom camp, but I'm in the pro-family camp. So
Yeah.
I'd love to have the discussion.
Yeah. Well, the thing about San Francisco, and I've thought about this a lot, and I think it's a very deep conversation, that isn't just something we can put into a soundbite. But like, I think San Francisco has a very particular religion, and it's transhumanism. And it's both digital transhumanism and biological transhumanism, but it's this view that we are kind of liberated from the body, from the self. We are individuals. And if you look at sort of all of the theory that's happening um, around artificial intelligence now, I actually think that it's going to be a much more prominent thesis or prominent view of what kind of people subscribe to in Silicon Valley. But I don't know that transhumanism is compatible with a lot of traditional religions and, frankly, with the family, right? Like, I think the family as an institution, is the most important institution as it stands in contrast to the state. And if you are building a family, it is a political act that actually is not aligned with the state in many ways. It is the only institution that can fight against the state. And I think that tech is gonna find itself in this very interesting, um, kind of with this question of, like, where do we see ourselves? Are we aligning more with the family? Or I is as we get more into social media in particular too, are we aligning more with the state? Because, tech was aligning with the state. Big tech was very much aligning with the state, for the last 4 years until Silicon Valley or until Elon Musk bought Twitter and renamed it X, and sort of we had this sort of deluge of free thought and free speech where the big tech wasn't necessarily aligning with the state. And I think the sort of oppressive nature of what was happening in Silicon Valley, where there was this kind of almost religious fervor around certain dogmas that didn't, that don't align with the views of traditional religions, whether it's Judaism or whether it's Christianity. Like there was a lot of, I would say, dogma that it was like, you believe this, and that is very different than kind of what I believed and espoused. And what I liked about Florida is that Florida is actually a very diverse, free place. No one is going to tell you what to believe. But you are allowed to practice your, religious religion. You are allowed to be, the kind of you build the kind of family that you want, in a way that I think California was just it was moving in a direction, particularly during COVID, where that was almost impossible to do. They were shuttering churches across the country, but of course, Florida famously was the first state to open back up. And I think that in some ways, for like that was the canary in the coal mine for a lot of people, that that where you live physically actually matters. And it matters, it's going to impact your family in ways that we can only imagine in the future.
You mentioned transhumanism. I've remarked to many people that I find that Yuval Noah Harari and some of his books is like the priest of I don't know if it's I wouldn't call it transhumanism until you did, but what I would call the non-corporeal uh, elements of society. It's all a story. Your biology doesn't matter. Your your family doesn't matter. It's all just kind of made up. Do
Mhm.
you agree with that statement?
The statement about him, or
Yeah,
that those things
him.
don't matter. Well, so I'll trust you on that aspect of it. Yes, like I think there's a lot of there's a lot of modern philosophers who preach that. Um, and I very much disagree. I mean, part of the reason why we start this conversation, where we did, is because I think your family history matters. Your religion matters, your culture matters, the story that you come from matters. Of course, like the American experiment is that none of that is going to stop you from achieving what you can. Like this is one of the kind of, I'd say, wonderful paradoxes about America, is like your history and family and culture matters, but you can achieve anything. And that I think is part of American dynamism and part of the American experiment. But to pretend as though where we came from, or what the American culture is, or what our religion is, or what our family history is, doesn't matter. That is a very modern dangerous thing. And I'll say I mean, I always like make fun of people who say dangerous and harms, but I think it's dangerous because like the minute that you allow, the minute where you strip yourself of all meaning, you just get filled with these platitudes. And of course, I do think that is why you saw sort of this progressive religion take off and wokeism, where people had no meaning anymore, and so they just adopted whatever the current thing was. And they didn't understand where they came from or what they should, they didn't even understand what they should be doing with their lives. And so that was something that I think we've kind of turned the page on in a really dramatic way, which I think very few people saw coming. And November 2022 with the purchase of X and sort of free speech being opened up, I think the world has shifted dramatically.
Before we dig into free speech, I want to ask you two more things. One is, we're on the era of AI right now, and obviously that's kind of another um, distancing. It's kind of the wrong word, maybe a separation between man and machine that's getting a little tighter or closer together. The separation is being blurred. Given what you said about family, where we came from, obviously the computers didn't come from anywhere. Where we came from, where do you see kind of, if we play this movie forward 10, 20 years, the delta between man and machine, man and robot?
Yeah, I mean, it, it seems to be happening faster than we could have ever anticipated. I spend most of my time investing in the physical world. And so, the kind of view of what is autonomy and what is AI, particularly in the Department of Defense. I always say in the US, the first agency that used the term artificial intelligence was actually inside the DoD. It was the Joint AI Center in 2018. And so it's something that, like, at least in my investing life, I've been thinking about for a while in terms of how these systems interact with the physical world and sort of the good things about that, right? Like I think if we move away from wars of mass and putting bodies in harm's way and we put machines in harm's way, everyone would agree that that is a much better way to live than to put human lives in harm's way. But when we think about it from the consumer aspect, as you said, where the sort of this view of what is the difference between man and machine, and how does that line, how do those sort of entities come together? I think it will be very important that people understand that there is a difference between their digital and their physical life. And I really haven't thought through it deeply, but until you asked this question, but like I think part of the reason why I love living in a place that is not dominated by the AI conversation or by technology is that I have very clean breaks between what is my physical life and my family life and what is the life that I live on the internet. I've talked about this a little bit in terms of why I think this is good for mothers in particular. When you kind of have to leave the workforce, or when you take maternity leave, how do you stay in conversation with all the people that you're used to talking to? How do you stay up to date on what's happening in the world while also nursing a baby to health? How do you do those things? And what's interesting is you have these very clean breaks between the physical world is in the home. And the virtual world is something I can participate in with no one even really recognizing what's happening in the home. And so I do think like having those sort of clean breaks of like my home life is different than the virtual life. That might actually be the way that we kind of maneuver through this. What does it mean to be man and what does it mean to be machine? That our work lives and sort of our digital lives are very much intertwined with this AI world, but that our home lives are sort of, I don't want to say protected from it, but like they don't engage with it in the same way. And maybe that will be something that will be the reason why people become so much more desperate to have families, is because the family is the only sort of organic physical thing that they can
Interesting.
build. And the virtual world is going to be, it's going to be flooded with all this ephemera that is very different than what they can build in their tangible life.
I've talked about with our mutual friend, Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamb, that the ultimate, the pinnacle of human creation is actually a child. And
Yeah.
it's, when you give life to another human being, it's the most godlike act that there is in the world. And I think that's the ultimate differentiator probably between man and machine, which you, I think, expressed very beautifully in talking about family that way. But it leads me to the question, do you have an Alexa in the house?
We don't. No.
You don't.
We
Do
don't.
you,
No, no, and maybe that's a good point. Maybe the house is already completely been bombarded with all of these AI tools, but we keep sort of we're not like total analog, but we don't have those things in the house yet. No robots.
But wait, do you want the laundry folding robot though?
No. Oh,
You
no. No,
don't.
like,
You want.
no, no. I've seen every version. It's so funny in investing. I've seen so many versions of the laundry folding robot, both from the, reading all like, it's like every every roboticist's first task is like, how do I get someone to fold my laundry, right? It's like it's of course it's some, young man who's in college or in grad school, like, what's the biggest problem I have in the home? It's I hate folding laundry. Um, but to me, that's probably one of the simpler problems to deal with in the family. It's very, very
Wait,
easy
but
to
do you have a Roomba? Do you have the laundry? That's like the what's it called the Roomba, the one that vacuums the floor?
No, no,
No,
but but
not
but
the
but the
lawnmower either.
no, 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 no robot that's, no,
And you
no,
don't want any of them?
there's probably more interesting problems, to fix, but I understand why everyone starts there, right? It's like everyone hates doing the dishes. Everyone hates, folding the laundry, but, every time I've seen those pitches, I'm like, is that real? Like, are consumers really gonna be, is that really the thing that consumers are gonna dole out money for to bring a robot into their home to do? Like, I don't know.
All right, that
Maybe?
leaves that leaves me very. How old are your children?
4 and 2.
I said they're a little
Um,
young. Are they going to
yeah.
do chores?
Yes. So that is a very good question. We are already trying to teach them, and of course they're boys, and trying to teach them to clean up their toys, let alone clean up other things, has been difficult. But we've just now instituted the piggy bank, which you get a nickel, and you
You get a
get to
Bitcoin.
yeah, no, 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 a nickel. We are a little old school. But you get a nickel, if you clean up your toys or if you do something in the backyard, and that nickel is still exciting to our oldest. We'll see when he realizes what it's actually worth, if he's doing chores. But right now, just having the nickel is a big deal. But yes, I think chores are very, very important. And yeah, and you're right. If you have eight children as you do, you probably don't need the Roomba, right?
I don't know if you're sensing the latest print of the CPI. I mean, that nickel's not going very far.
Yeah, it's definitely not going no, I'm sorry, he hasn't figured it out yet.
Yeah.
We're definitely
Just
taking advantage of free labor.
just wait till you get to the tooth fairy. I can tell you through 8 kids, there's been a lot of inflation in what the tooth fairy has had to give them. They
What
obviously
they
don't know
expect.
who it is, but
Yes, yes, what they expect is going to be much higher.
yeah. So you wrote, like, I think you tweeted this. Um, I have the quote. This is one very selfish reason why, if you aspire to greatness, you should also build a family. If you're surrounded by family, when the mob comes for you, the sting of your enemies and critics will be far less overwhelming. I, by the way, completely agree with this comment. But um, I was struck by it because it feels like you wrote this in response to something, and I was wondering what that was.
Oh gosh, yeah, I mean, I I'm trying to think if there was any sort of actual event. It's more that I think, like, we live our like, you can live your life expecting that at some point the mob will come for you, and the mob can be, in the case of these very famous, like, we just saw the comeback story of a lifetime and Donald Trump being elected president again. If you had asked me a year ago, would he be elected? I think people looked and saw, like, no, there's a likely chance he's going to jail, right? And look at where the world is today. Um, and I think the Elon Musk story is a perfect example of this too, right? Where it's like the highs and lows of where he has been throughout his career. He constantly has critics on his back, just trying to destroy what he has built. And I think the only way to inure yourself from sort of the sort of story of life, which is that if you ever achieve anything great, if you ever do anything wonderful, if you ever, send a rocket into space and reland it, there are going to be people just completely picking away at you. And the only way to inoculate yourself from sort of that constant criticism or the constant sort of people trying to tear you down is to have a rooted family that is going to outlast you. And I think, my sort of critics or my sort of like little nitpicks or whatever, like, those are not nearly anything like the ones I just described. But the having a family that you have, in some ways, it's like you have total control over how you raise your children. Yes, your children are independent beings, but like you can create a safety. You can create a safety net around your kids. You can create a world around your kids. I always say, like, my kids have no idea anything exists outside of, like, fire engines and cars and rockets. Like, their entire world is what my husband and I have created for them. And it's beautiful. And like, there's something about contrasting that with sort of the dangers of the world that we live in, the outside world, where I think to me that is like the root of happiness, the root of safety, the root of beauty is in that family. And one of the things that looking at sort of Elon and these sort of the sort of great men theory of history, like one of the things that I've just been hearing a lot more in Silicon Valley is just like how many heroes we have and like what heroism is. But, like, being a father or a mother is the heroic act. It is the thing that, even if you don't put, land a man on the moon or take a man to Mars, if you create a family who've done something that has a legacy that is beautiful and is the ultimate thing to build, is the ultimate institution to build. And I sometimes think Silicon Valley doesn't recognize this, but the rest of the world does. And so yeah, that's probably where it was coming from, which is just the highs and lows of a job or the highs and lows of building a company or the highs and lows of building an institution can take you in a lot of directions. But if you've built a family, you're at least rooted in something that's going to outlast you.
So, first of all, I totally agree with you. In my books, I've talked about this is like the most selfless act there can be, right? Which is you have kids, you have a family, you give all your time. You actually learn to tolerate people because all your kids are different over time. And by the way, eventually
Yes.
they go out of the cocoon that we all try to create for them and develop independence. But I think the interesting thing is, you're a religious person. I think that's not a secret to anybody. I am as well. But if you look at the world, the family has come apart, and childbirth has come apart. And Elon's been all over this. I've written about this extensively. Certainly, 10, 20 years ago, almost none of the European leaders had any children. Right? Angela Merkel had no children. Macron has no children. At the time, the prime minister of the UK, I'm blanking on her name now, Liz Truss, had no children. And many world leaders had no children, and demographics are falling off a cliff. We have a natalism problem in the world, and I think clearly the Hebrew Bible and the New and the Old Testament are all pro-natal and obviously pro-family. The family is at the core of it. It's actually not the state and not the politics, right? The king in the Hebrew Bible it has his wings clipped to start. It's the family that's the center of it. But as secularism and certainly wokeism has ascended, I think the family has taken a back seat. And so why do you think that your kids, my kids, our grandkids, will have a optimistic future, given that a large part of the world has kind of abandoned the family or decided not to invest it and have children?
I think we have to. This is probably the biggest critical issue that we have to fix. Is family formation, but also, as you said, like the natalism problem is the biggest problem. The fact that people are not having children, and part of the reason for that I don't think I recognized until I had children is because having children is it is a civilizing force on society.
Agreed.
And I always point out the fact that like when we take our kids out into the world when we go to the mall or we go to a restaurant or whatever, it's like there's something about everyone wanting to protect, that should exist like this, where everyone wants to protect or people watch their language. There's little things that people do that are far more civilized if there are children around. But less and less children means that fewer people know how to do those things. Fewer people have empathy for what it means to have children. One of the reasons we love, as you said, like, South Florida is filled with old people. It's filled with grandparents. And so they are very kind. Like they understand what children act like in a restaurant, or they understand that you're trying to teach your children. And there's sort of just a kind, just an understanding that we are doing something for civilization by having children. But in cities or in places where there aren't very many children, people really don't like having children around, or they don't understand like that sometimes it takes a little bit longer to do something because there's a child that's engaging in that activity. And so as there are fewer and fewer children in society, I would say society becomes much colder. And that sort of coldness of society is manifesting itself in ways that I think are very much linked to this family issue. When we talk about like the loneliness issue and sort of how lonely, young men are, or how lonely, people are that they don't even leave their houses, like that this is actually a public health crisis in America, that there is so much loneliness and that it's killing people. That is because there are not enough children. And that is because people have decided not to have families. And that is because the family has been destroyed as sort of the institution that would take care of that person who doesn't have a family, or take care of the weakest link in their family. And so, to me, this is the biggest crisis: is that the family as an institution exists to do what the state cannot. It exists to give unconditional love, empathy, to take care of the weakest link in the flock. That is not something the state was ever set up to do. And as the family is destroyed, or as it becomes far, far weaker, that's why you have sort of these public health crises that didn't exist in the 50s or the 60s, or didn't exist in such a strong form, because they were dealt with and handled by the family, by the mother, by the father, by the people who cared the most about the people who were experiencing them. And so if we don't figure out a way to protect not only just child rearing, to have more children for a variety of economic reasons, but if we don't figure out a way to have stronger families to take care of those people, it's just going to be a crisis for the West.
I think you'll find this somewhere between humorous and sad, but because I was an investor in WeWork, I get pitched a lot of like community ideas. And it was someone came to me about 4 or 5 months ago from Texas, actually, and he was in Israel. And he said, male loneliness is a real problem in Texas and in other places. I said, imagine it's less in Texas than in many places, but whatever. And he said, and I want to create an online app for men only, and then men's clubs for this. And I said, I got a better idea. Why don't they go to church and synagogue? And that it's co-ed. It'll solve a lot of loneliness problems. And I saw somewhere you said, I think maybe Sal Churi, another mutual friend of ours,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, maybe suggested I ask you this, which is somewhere I think I saw you say it's good to be bored in church.
Yeah. Yes.
Tell me about being bored in church.
Yes. Well, this is very interesting, because I actually think this is a more common theme. I actually think Jews and Catholics have this in common, where the practice of going to church is actually just as important as the belief. And when I said before, the most important political act that I've had is actually moving to Florida. It's not something I believe, but it's something that I have done. I actually think for Catholics, the practice of going to church matters. And so even if you're not paying attention, or you're bored, or you don't necessarily feel like going that day, the fact that you are going to church and that you are engaging in a practice is actually part of the meditation. It is part of the prayer. And one of the things that I think I hear, a lot of young parents say is like, oh, my children are like way too young to go to church. And I don't get anything out of church. If I take them to church, all I'm doing, and it is like embarrassing to watch us in the back of church. We sit in the very back of church with two boys who can they can sit still for 90 seconds. And we feed them like constantly, like we're giving them lollipops. We're doing all these things to just keep them quiet. I have a purse full of like little Matchbox cars, and they get a different car every 2 minutes. I mean, it is hilarious, but then also like every week people are like, this is like that family's here, right? But we're one of the only young families in this church. Like there's probably three or four there's probably three or four families that come when at the same mass that we do. And it's like, even though I don't get to pay attention the way that I would love to, or I'm not sitting there in solemn prayer, or like really, getting the spiritual experience, the fact that I am bringing my children to church, and that every week they are going to learn something new. Maybe it's that my 4-year-old will actually kneel down for 10 seconds this time, right? Like it's like that they are actually learning and engaging in something, knowing that we are a family that goes to church is like, it is important. And it is the practice of that matters. And there's a huge debate among, like, I would say even among Catholics, but definitely in Protestant churches, about whether you should, force your children to sit through something boring. And I think the boredom is part of it. It's like sometimes we do things that are boring. Sometimes you have to be quiet if you're in a place of worship. Like learning that as early as possible is actually a very good thing for their development.
And to that, I'll say amen. Uh,
Yeah, I'm glad you agree with that, but I do think it is a heated debate among young families whether they should engage in that.
yeah, listen, my poor father, he used to take us to synagogue on Saturdays, and walking down past the statue of Teddy Roosevelt outside the Museum of Natural History in New York, and that statue is no longer there, unfortunately. I hope they return it soon. My poor dad has to watch us, kind of run up the stairs in front of the Museum of Natural History. All he wanted to do was get to synagogue, but he had to kind of be patient with us till we got there, and then we sat patiently for 2.5 hours. and even have to
Which
listen
is
to the
incredible.
rabbi.
2.5 hours. 90 seconds is sort of our,
Yeah. But you don't bring devices into entertainment. It's only lollipops, not devices, right?
Oh, no, no, no. I mean, it's and that I actually think, I mean, to like, there are so few places in modern, I would say, in sort of, yeah, modern physical world where if your children are acting up, where you're not gonna bring out a device, right? Like, and this is like, a lot of people who don't have kids say, "I would never introduce screens to my child." It's like, well, just wait until you're, like, in an airport and you have the world looking at you like, "Why can't you get this kid not to scream?" Right? Like, you're going to bring out the Cocomelon. Like, you're just going to do it because you're like, you no one can withstand that kind of pressure. But inside of a house of worship, you're not gonna bring it out. Like, your children are going to have to learn to pay attention. It's, it's the same reason, like, I at a similar, tweet storm, I talked about why I think piano lessons are so important. And I do think pianos are going the same way as learning a language, right? Like, we're not gonna need to know language, to your point, because AI is gonna be everywhere, and, like, you're not gonna need to learn any language because you can just translate it through your phone. And so we're not gonna have, in 20, 30 years, we're not gonna have the same sort of study of multiple languages that we have today. But it is important to learn those things because focusing and paying attention and not having devices around and learning to memorize, learning to look at notes, these things are really good for our brains. And I think you're gonna tell a huge difference between the kids who had those sort of practices from an early age and the ones who've been completely, I would say, uh, forced to only interact with screens. And that there's going to be a kind of a difference, in how these children are raised.
Just yesterday, I downloaded Duolingo to start teaching myself Arabic.
Oh,
Uh,
wow, wow, that's
because
that is impressive.
Yeah, well, I'll let you know afterwards whether you should be impressed or not. Let
Yeah.
me ask you another Machiavellian question. So I think it's this Friday, the Supreme Court is about to decide on the TikTok ban that's due, I think, on the 19th, which is the day before the inauguration. President Trump has said, perhaps reconsider this and give me a chance for a political solution. Maybe the other reason that Zuck came out so hard against the China thing right now is he actually wants TikTok out of the market. He says, hey, I'm going to open up, be like Elon, but keep that TikTok thing out. It leaves my social media game here. It's like, that I'd argue it's 4D chess, but Mark is a very smart guy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, no, he very well could be, like, I certainly think he's always as you said, like, he's looking around the bend for opportunity. But I also think that it is a clear sign that for normal people, it's like I like to bucket myself inside the normal camp, right? I'm not Mark Zuckerberg. It just means that I can be louder. Like, how it
Oh,
affects
you've been
my
loud
life.
already. Come on.
Well, I could be even louder that I have been. And I think that's exciting. It's just gonna inspire more people, to actually speak what they believe, and to not back down if they're told, "Hey, you can't say that." Or that's, it's going to have widespread ramifications, and I don't think it's going away.
Are you in the ban TikTok camp or the let TikTok keep operating camp?
I think TikTok is a weapon of the communist regime. I think 100% it should be banned, or it should be, if it is removed from the CCP. I think the president very much likes to find really unique, diplomatic solutions. He likes to make deals, right? But I think there is no denying that it is a weapon of the CCP. It has been a very powerful weapon. And it needs it, we there is an if you take any other form of technology, if you said, hey, should Russia be allowed to own television stations inside of the US during the Cold War? People would say absolutely not. Like, that's absurd. Why would we allow a propaganda machine into our country to poison the minds of our young people, to poison the minds of our countrymen? Um, to me, it is very clear what it exists as, and so there has to be a solution. Whether that solution is an outright ban or whether it's, changing ownership, to a U.S. entity. I care less about the specifics of it, but I think it is obvious that it is owned, and operated as a weapon of the CCP.
So I want to ask a question that's kind of related to that, which is I think it's reasonable to say, I'm with you, by the way. I think it's a giant psyop operation, and that has, by the way, helped advance the woke undermining of patriotism in the United States, and obviously shine a positive light on on China. I was fortunate to speak, actually, by the way, right near where you are in Palm Beach, and in West Palm Beach, for the Manhattan Institute, and I followed Vivek Ramaswamy right after he had published his book Woke Inc. And uh, reading his book and thinking has caused me to ask the following question of myself. So we're all concerned about uh, DEI and wokeism penetrating corporate America and corporations in general. What's to prevent the other side of that, so to speak, which is if you're doing an American dynamism thing, obviously you're putting your values first, and the U.S. government, so to speak, has a seat at the table, not in a shareholder way, but kind of, hey, you sell to the government, they set a lot, they set a lot of the rules. You're a person of belief, like myself. What's to stop kind of the same thing happening, I don't want to say on the other side, but from a different angle, where these kind of corrosive values, perhaps, uh, maybe it's government, uh, you know, domineering behavior, maybe it's government values, or maybe it's just religious values that end up influencing the corporation too much.
Well, I don't think you have to work for a company where you don't share the values of that company. I've left organizations and companies where I didn't share their values or where I felt that my values would be better served in a different entity. And I think like that's something where I think the myth that we've been fed for way too long is that your religious, your purpose, all of those things in life are separate from work. And I actually think this is a little bit different than what a lot of my friends in Silicon Valley think, where it's like you should, the way we combat wokeism is to leave our values at the door and to come in and to just work on the mission at hand. And I think there's
That's
some
like
good that
Brian Armstrong of Coinbase, right?
yeah, and I think
Yeah.
the Coinbase memo was very much of its time. It is very important. I think for a lot of companies, that is the right way to run a company, which is leave all of your stuff at the door, come in and just do the work. But I also think for people who feel very deeply about their values and their responsibility to society, like for, people who work on American Dynamism, like you can't really leave yourself at the door. You want to work for a company that actually espouses the beliefs that you have, that you feel proud going into work every day. And I think for people who have strong values in that way, they need to find a place where the mission that they are working on in their life, their calling in their life, matches the things that they believe. Not everyone has that. I think there's a lot of people who are just like the thing that matters most to them is their hobbies or their family or whatever it is, and like they don't really necessarily want to take it to work, and that's fine too. So we need all of it, but like I don't think that I could just go to work and leave myself at the door, not talk about who I am, what I believe, what like, and then just go invest in startups. Like that's not who I am. It might be who other people are, but it's not who I am. And so I think we need both. And the most important thing for me was, throughout my career has been finding institutions and organizations that match my beliefs that I can believe in 100%. Because investing in particular, and we haven't really gotten to this,
We're getting there
investing
soon.
in well, investing is about belief. It is belief. Like it is the manifestation of belief, which is very different than reason. It is belief in things that don't exist yet. And if you don't allow yourself to be moved by that belief, like you can't really do the job. So I try to match the things that I invest in with the things that I truly believe, because I don't think I could do the job otherwise.
And what is your core value or core belief?
I mean, the things that I'd say if I had to write out the things that drive me every day, it is, AMDG, like for the greater glory of God, and then American Dynamism, which is like God and country. I joked like before American Dynamism existed, someone asked me like, well, what do you invest in? And I had just made an investment in a company called Hallow, which is a prayer app. That when I first invested in that company, I think people thought it was kind of hysterical, like a Catholic prayer app, like that's gonna be a Silicon Valley backed company. But I sort of joked after that. I was like, gosh, well, I've invested in Anduril and I've invested in Hallow. Like maybe my actual investment thesis is God and country, which has not been a terrible investment thesis or thesis for life for millennia. Like a lot of people live their life by that. But for some reason, Silicon Valley, like just God and country didn't really resonate as an investment thesis. But I do think like American Dynamism is sort of the manifestation of that. It's what matters most to American citizens or American citizens. It is, companies that support the national interest and the interests of our allies. It is the things that people care the most about, the American dream, and investing in categories where, if we can bring the cost down of the American dream, if we can invest in things that truly support defense, that support the things that government cares about as well, people are going to be able to pursue that dynamism in whatever, however they view it.
I've seen you say before that belief trumps data in the past. So the first part I want to ask about that is, what about the Anduril founders in particular caused you to believe in them? Because there was a big leap of faith
Yes.
in Anduril. And then the second thing I want to ask you is, some people would argue that when you have this belief system, and by the way, I'm kind of the same way. I'm not I don't know anything about technology, candidly. And, but I believe in people with unique ideas and big aspirations, call them God and country. Also, when does that kind of turn into deluding ourselves? Uh, that something is real or possible when it isn't.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of delusion in investing. And there's a lot of you become very humbled very quickly in investing too, which I also think is part of the wonderful things we get to experience in our job. But to go back to the belief versus data, like I, I'm coming up on 10 years of investing, which is like flown by, but it also feels like wow, it's like the world has changed a lot in 10 years. And maybe 5 years ago I was on a podcast and I sort of borrowed from the ancients and said that, investing is a combination of reason versus revelation. And I said it's sort of this unique combination,
I
and
love that.
when you use reason and when you use revelation are very different things, but like they need to come together. And I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I said that, I probably felt like I used reason and revelation equally. And when I look back now, 10 years later, I think revelation is so much more important than reason when it comes to early stage investing. And what I mean by that is, if you sit down and you're like, I'm going to do diligence, and to go to your question on Andrew, I'm going to do diligence, and I'm going to sit down, I'm going to make my little diligence box, and I'm going to call all these people who know the founders of Andrew. I'm going to call everyone at Facebook who knows Palmer Luckey, and I'm going to do all these comps based on Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. I'm going to do this standard Harvard Business School diligence packet. You will never invest in Anduril. Like you would never invest in that company at the earliest of stages. Like an X on everyone, right? Like Palmer will talk about it publicly. He had just been fired from Facebook. The worst market you could have ever invested in is defense in 2017. Donald Trump had just come in as president. No one wanted to touch anything related to defense and national security because of what was happening at the border. It was like it was the worst possible investment based on sort of that HBS standard diligence reason packet. But in terms of the revelation packet, which again, it's like there's the reason box if you think it's just like a little box, but everything outside of that box is revelation. It's what the universe or God, I mean, if you're not a religious person, you say the universe. I'm a religious person, right? It's what God is trying to tell you. It is what it is all these little signs that you are getting about where the world is headed. And in the context of the Anduril investment, it was like someone on the outside was just like pounding me on the head with like wake up. The world is changing. Like we need a new defense prime. We need people who are serious about their motivations in the world. And this is the team that's going to do it.
They
And it
said the
was like,
Messiah is like a guy in a Hawaiian shirt and shorts, right? That's
oh, but it was obvious. It was so obvious. It's like here you have some of the best technologists in the world going after one of the most important problems. No one believes they can do it.
No, it wasn't
Uh,
obvious. I don't believe that. It was not obvious.
well, but it was from a revelation perspective. I had complete certainty.
What were yeah, what were some of the signs though? Like, tell us, is it a gut? Is it revelation? Or there are some signs you go, okay, now I understand that's what it was, even if you didn't fully
But I
understand
think
it.
that is revelation, right? Like
I like that.
and maybe I'll use um, as we learn more about what intelligence is, right? It's like a LLM takes in so much information, and you don't really know what's relevant until you get the prompt. right? And like that's kind of how our minds are too, right? We take in so much data every day. And another reason why, and we'll get to this sort of do you work in person or work from home? I work from home, right, for most of the time. But I'm constantly taking in data, whether it's on this, whether it's, it's talking to people. I'm constantly taking in all of this data and I control the inflow of data into my brain. But it's like when the prompt is, should I invest in this company? It doesn't make sense to narrow it to the point where I'm just looking at this sort of HBS diligence reason packet. It's like, what are all of these things that exist outside of the prompt that are influencing how I make decisions? Now, our limited partners, like I'm like thinking like no one wants to think that's how you're making decisions about investments, right? Like that that it sounds like a little bit woo-woo, right? But it's actually like your sort of model for how the world works. You'll have these sort of moments where you're talking to someone and, it's like every great investment that I have made, it hasn't come from sitting down and doing a spreadsheet in the, Stanford Business School or HBS sort of like way of doing things. It's come from like someone says something that just triggers something where you can't stop thinking about it. And then it's like you see another thing where you're like, wow, like that is an incredible piece of data or information, and it leads you to conviction. But that's not reason. Like you can reason it out sort of retroactively. That's something is being revealed to you because you are open and listening to whatever the universe or God or the people around you are trying to tell you. And I think like if you think of what are, any movements that have happened recently, the people who are mocking Elon in November of 2022 for buying Twitter, like he saw something and had conviction in what was going to happen only a few years later that now has become obvious to everyone. But he sort of something had been revealed to him that gave him conviction that this needed to happen. And I do think that is like just being open to the data that is around you. I actually think it's never been easier to be open to the data that's around you because the algorithms on our phone actually help us. As long as we tune them correctly, as long as we are, following the right people and listening to the right conversations and really understanding where the world is headed, you can be a lot more thoughtful about where the world is going.
And what was it about Hallow?
So Hallow is an amazing story, actually. So I sort of begrudgingly agreed to go to Stanford Business School and judge a pitch competition. Sometimes you go to these things where you're like, oh, like I'm just going to do this because someone asked me to do it. I wasn't expecting to see a company that could actually be a generational company at a business school that day. But I think it was 2018 or maybe 2019. And I was judging this pitch competition of business school students, and everything was like whatever the hot thing was happening that day. It was like crypto or consumer economy or influencer economy, or it was also like whatever the hypey trends were. And Alex Jones, who's the founder of Hallow, he was a business school student at the time, stands up and he says, I am building a Catholic meditation app for myself that I use every day, and it is going to change the way that people pray. And I just sort of like my like the hair stood up on my head. It was just sort of like I like, whoa, like here's a person. And I think people laughed. I think it was one of those things where like it was so out of the norm at a elite business school that someone would come up and say this, that I think there was sort of like murmurs in the crowd, like that's so weird, right? And I still remember like the seriousness with which he said it. He looked straight at me and said it, and I just said, okay, like I have to see what this is. I ran up to him after the pitch competition, and I said, I need to learn more about this. Where can I download it? I downloaded it. I used it. I said, I need to invest in this. The funny story is I was actually too late. He had already like gone out and pitched, many seed firms and everything. I think I brought him in the next day to my firm, and he pitched, but it was too late. The round was already full, and I was upset about that. But I stayed in touch with him for a year. And the funny thing is when I was going out on maternity leave, and I said, if you decide to raise, please call me. Like, please call me. Like I cannot manage to, like, I don't want to lose working with you twice. And so I think my son was 3 weeks old, and he said, I hate calling you while you're on maternity leave, but like we're being preempted, and like I need to know whether you want to invest. And within 2 days, we had invested, and so it was an extraordinary story and outcome and everything. But he's just what was so obvious to me about what he was doing was usually when people are building in the faith category, they are not great technologists. They are not just like they don't have the ambition to build something of scale. And he was the first person that I met where I was like, this person is of extraordinary intellect. He's going to run it as a business, not as like a do-gooder sort of like I'm like creating this thing that's nice to have. He wants to create scale. And the fact that he's hired the team that he has, the fact that it's grown the way that it has is something that he could only do himself. Like it was just a founder mission fit. And of course, a lot of people hadn't tried to raise venture capital to do this because they figured, okay, like who in Silicon Valley is going to bet on a Catholic meditation app? And it turns out actually a lot of people have bet on a Catholic meditation app. Like 1 billion people subscribe to this religion. It's a massive market. And there is sort of a reason component to why you would think that this would be a big company. So but in terms of why I got it so excited, I was just I know this is a great founder. And he's just done an extraordinary job with the company.
Yeah, the Catholic TAM is a lot bigger than the Jewish TAM, that's for sure.
That is true. This is really super scale.
So, that begs the question, there you were sitting in Stanford, Alex got up, and your hair stood on end, and now you work from home behind Zoom. Like, how do you invest like that? I can't, by the way. I just, hands up, I'm an old guy. I can't do this on Zoom. I need to meet the people and have my hair stand on end.
Well, I will say I meet people. So I will say I meet founders in the process of, I think you can organize your time a lot better when certain days are in person and certain days are on Zoom. So I'm not a 100%, you can do this job completely behind a camera. I do think you need to meet people. I do think you need to work with people in person. It's more that I actually think there's something about, it's actually not about the technology. It's more about being separated from the herd that I actually think has been really valuable for me. So when I lived in Silicon Valley, I used to get invited to dinners constantly. I mean, I still do, but like you get invited to dinners, you're constantly at breakfast, and you're constantly around what the hive mind is thinking. And I actually think it becomes this sort of circuitous, like, are we gaslighting each other? Like, are these real things? Like, are we really around like what's happening in the real world? And there was something that I think has actually been very beneficial of leaving Silicon Valley and moving to a place that is so orthogonal to the tech world, which is, Florida. Florida is just completely outside of that world, where I think that if what you were looking for as an investor is truth and where the world is headed, I I feel like I've had a better barometer in Florida than I did in Silicon Valley.
Interesting.
Uh, like, and part of it is I do think like the Silicon Valley sort of ecosystem and early sort of what's happening there is on the phone now. It is on X. You can curate it. So I feel like in some ways my digital life, like, if I were just talking to people in group chats and on X, like no one knows where I am. It doesn't really matter where you are, right? Like your location is you're on the internet. And I spend a lot of time on the internet. Like I am constantly plugged in. So I feel like I have that sort of part of my life covered. But there's something about being in the real world outside of sort of what that sort of tech ecosystem is, where I feel like the balance of that, sort of the physical world and the virtual world being so separate, actually gives me a better understanding of what's happening in the present and where the future is headed. And maybe that balance will someday get off. Like I think I have to protect that balance really well. But like there's something about when I look at my investing career, I don't fall as quickly for trends. I don't fall as quickly for this is going to like there's something about being again in the family, rooted in reality, rooted in where the world is today for the vast majority of people, but also having access to the future on this phone that like has been the right balance for me. And it might not be the right balance for everyone. I'm sure for founders, like I think it's very hard for founders to do that. I think it's different for investors. I think it's very hard for founders to build virtually unless they have a very strict philosophy of why they're doing that. But there's something about that being kind of those parallels paths that has helped me sort of answer questions when it comes to investing.
Do you think that being both Catholic and in Florida makes you more of a contrarian?
Yes, but it's interesting the contrarian thing. Being contrarian for contrarian's sake
Sure.
um, is become very in vogue, in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago, right? Like when I started out, like that was not a good thing, and now it's like everyone wants to be a contrarian, everyone wants to be a difficult person, right? So we've sort of, again, we've done a 180 in terms of what profiles and how people act are celebrated in Silicon Valley. And like, um, I, there, there's something about being sort of like living my life more authentically to who I am, which is as a Catholic, but also like I am surrounded by family. I am in a place where I feel surrounded by people who share my values. That probably allows me to flourish in a way where I wasn't necessarily flourishing in the way that I wanted to when I was living in San Francisco, not doing that. Or doing that in a more covert way, or feeling like those values, like I couldn't live in a completely like flourishing way. Maybe there's something to that where it's like if you are living as authentically as you possibly can, and you have sort of the community around you that allows you to thrive, then you're going to be more successful at your job. You're going to be more successful. I always think like for a lot of people, it stuns new mothers when I say this. Like you're going to be more successful in your job when you're a mom. You're just
100%.
because you're gonna be more confident, you're gonna be surrounded by people who love you, you're gonna, like, live your life more authentically, you're gonna be the best version of yourself, and, people are gonna recognize that, and people are gonna respond to you differently, and I certainly saw that. Like, I think, my career took off when I became a mother in a way that, like, I wasn't living as fully as I could, when I was just living for myself.
I've written about
Um
this in my books. Being a parent teaches you tolerance. Being a parent teaches you executive function. Being a parent gives you more support for your family, and being married, obviously. And I'm a huge fan of that. I need though to take this around somewhere actually because of what you said. I was talking to Sal about this. I'm not going to ask you this question, but now I'm going to ask you this question.
Go for
Sal, Sal Churi. So
Yeah.
when I think about what's going on in Google, which is in Silicon Valley and kind of the opposite of what I would call God and country, they like protested people working on behalf of the Department of Defense, employees at Google. In my own existence, which is in Israel, investing in Israel, the whole tech ecosystem comes out of working for defense.
Yeah.
Essentially, it comes out of the military, and I wonder how you think about that over the next 10 years. Whether that changes in Silicon Valley. One, does the election of Trump change that in any way, and change your approach to how you approach that? And whether there's just two Americas, the one that kind of doesn't want to do this stuff, and the one that has an American flag in the background and talks about God and country.
Yeah. So I probably would have said that a few years ago. I actually think there's something that shifted where the best engineers and our top, like our best and brightest engineering minds actually do want to work on the hardest problems. Again, I don't want to like say everything is because of Elon, but I think it's between SpaceX, Palantir, the companies that have been around doing this for a very long time. They're just very, very good at curating talent. Like the most talented manufacturers come out of SpaceX. Like some of the most talented engineers come out of Palantir. And there's something about when I look at our portfolio of new companies that are scaling, a lot of them come from those companies. A lot of them come from SpaceX. A lot of them come from Palantir, increasingly Anduril. And what's interesting that's a new thing that we've seen, as you said, in Israel, a lot of people already work in defense. We've actually backed a ton of veterans, which I think would surprise people. We've backed a lot of founder CEOs who, have served their country. They go work at one of these companies. They understand sort of the pace of startup life, but they also understand how to speak to the customer, and they have the trust of the customer because they've served. Where I think we're going to see more of that, where I think it's not going to be uncommon for people to serve their country, whether it's in the SEALs, whether it's in the Army, the Navy, then go work at a Palantir, Anduril, one of these scaled companies where they see what a great organization looks like. They see what great scale looks like, and then they build their own company. Like we're seeing more and more of that. So I'm very excited about that because I do think it kind of bridges, as you said, if there are two Americas, if there's the America where people go and serve their country, and then the America where people go immediately and work in tech. I think that's kind of coming closer and closer together. I also think you mentioned the election of President Trump. I actually think the election of JD Vance matters just as much because that is, it is someone who served their country as a Marine, who understands what Silicon Valley is because he worked in Silicon Valley. He worked as a venture capitalist, and he's sort of bridging those worlds in his career, where he's served his country proudly, and then he's also understands sort of how the economics of the capital of America, America's risk capital work. He understands how that works in a way that a lot of people in Washington just do not understand. And I think that will lead to more and more people in DC understanding how these worlds come together.
I met JD, now Vice President-elect Vance, for the first time at Jacob Hellberg's Hilda Valley conference, where I'm like,
Oh, great. Wonderful.
the only Israeli there generally, and this is a bunch of years ago. But what do you think about like this inside Google thing, where people say, no, we're not going to work with the country, we don't work with the Department of Defense?
Well, I mean, the height was 2017 when the Google employees stormed out because of Project Maven. And that was that was the impetus for Anduril too. It was the tipping point of, okay, like the greatest companies in America aren't going to work with the DoD. We have to build them. It's funny how Google has sort of reversed course on some of these things. Certainly in our world, Google's tried to say, oh, actually, no, we very much want to work with the DoD. And there has been sort of a movement away from what happened. I mean, it's been almost 8 years now. So there is sort of to your earlier point, like are some of the CEOs that were, more focused on censorship or going align with sort of the views going align with those views. A lot of them have reversed course. And so in some ways I'm big tent about it. Like the more people that want to work on this, the better. And if people realize that there was an error in their ways 10 years ago and they want to come work on defense, I feel like that's probably forgiveness is probably a good thing and let people work on it. But I do think that
Forgiveness is a religious trait.
yes, absolutely. It's important. There's no forgiveness in wokeness, but there's forgiveness in most other world religions. And so I would say like that's actually a good thing. And like let's let Google work on some of these projects if they now see that there's value in it and they see the importance of it.
Yeah, I've often joked that religion and repentance is anti-cancel culture. Um,
Much.
yeah.
Yes.
All right, one more long question before I get to a rapid fire round. So people don't know probably, but you started your career at the Washington Post and in media. I actually just published my podcast with Jessica Lesson, and now you're on the board of the Free Press, and we share that in common too. I'm not on the board, but I'm, for full disclosure, one of the investors in the Free Press and a big fan of Barry Weiss. What's the future of media? Is it X? Is it the Free Press? Is it professional newsrooms or we the media? I was talking to my friend Stefan Thompson of Visegrad just this morning, who said that he thinks Jessica Lesson is right. You need real newsrooms. It can't all be we the media. Where do you come out on this?
So I look at media as no different than how I would assess any other founder or any other tech company, which is that the founders that have the strongest points of view are the ones who are going to win. And the reason I'll brag on Barry and the Free Press. I remember where I was sitting when Barry Weiss. I was actually. It was during COVID. I think it was July of 2020 when she wrote her letter resigning from the New York Times. It was epic. I remember reading it and being like, actually, the first thing I did was I texted Chris Best at Substack and I said, "You have to get Barry." He's like, I know, we have to get Barry." But at the time, I was trying to court him for investment. I wasn't an investor. But it was one of these things where it was just like someone with that clarity of purpose and view and worldview, like just such clarity. Um, those are the sorts of people who create the newsrooms of tomorrow. And very singular in that regard. I mean, she is just extraordinary to the point where, it's like the fact that I even remember that moment says something about her words, her understanding of where the world is headed. And it was very clear to me even then that she was going to build an extraordinary newsroom. It wasn't just going to be a Barry Weiss, newsletter or here are my thoughts. Like that, she actually is capable of leading an extraordinary new institution. And we are the beneficiaries that she wants to create an institution, that she wants to create something that is not just her, that is an enduring newsroom. And so, in some ways, it's like the future of media is that. A lot of people in media do not have that. A lot of, part of the reason I left media, I saw, I mean, now it's 15 years ago, there was such little understanding of where the world was headed, of how technology was impacting the business model. I mean, it was, in some ways I felt like when I was, it was, ancient history now when I was at the Washington Post, but it was the first industry that was being completely disrupted by technology. Really, like all of the business models were completely destroyed in the early 2000s by what Google was doing. And, and the people who understood it could get ahead of it, but a lot of people didn't. It was like, no, no, no. This is how the news has always been done. It's always going to be done this way. And I think that, there's always a lot of talk on the business model, but like the thing that like people like Barry and the thing that like will actually decide what newsrooms thrive in this new environment is, do you have moral clarity? Do you understand what your newsroom actually stands for. And, there's a lot of people who want to innovate on the model, but they don't talk about that. And like what all great founders do is they know what their thesis is. They know that they're building for, in some cases, a limited TAM, right? Like they're building for a certain customer. And then that customer can grow over time, but they have a very unique perspective of who they are writing for, who they are building for. And that's what Barry's done so well with the Free Press. It's just extraordinary to watch. And, it's I don't want to pat myself on the back too much for knowing that was going to happen when I read the letter, but it's like, again, revelation. It's obvious. It was obvious in that moment. Like, here is someone who's going to build something enduring. And it's just incredible what she's been able to do.
So you've talked a lot about Elon, and now we talked about Barry, and you talked about Elon buying Twitter as a seminal moment. I've wondered whether when history is written, I'm pretty certain it'll be Elon buying Twitter, but I often think about Barry as being the person who broke open the Overton window even before Elon did, certainly chronologically. What do you think, Barry or Elon?
Well, so I mean, I
And then she
think
did the Twitter files, by the way, which is super interesting.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Barry, because she was immersed inside, what was so important about what Barry did was she was an insider. And she had an incredible job. Like she was right. She was in some ways, there were people who didn't like her inside the New York Times, but she also had incredible bylines and she had incredible power, right? Like she had incredible power inside that institution. And she said, I cannot work at an organization that is silencing me or that is not allowing these voices to be here. I see what is happening. I see sort of the censoriousness of this organization, and I am not going to let it happen. I am leaving. And I think in some ways, like being that public about what was happening inside the institution, relinquishing your power as someone who had never founded a company, who didn't know if her audience was going to follow her, right? Like she's far more famous and successful now than she was when she was at the New York Times, and probably didn't think that would happen. So it's like to say I do not believe in what is happening inside this institution and I am leaving. Again, that is like a powerful, powerful thing to do that inspires other people to do it. And so I think it is like the ultimate act of courage to say I am leaving. I am giving up my power because I do not agree with the direction that something is going in, even knowing that I might not be able to build something as large or as important as the New York Times. I agree with you. I think it was one of these seminal moments, especially for people who follow media, because it was someone inside the building who was critiquing it. It wasn't someone outside that couldn't make it in there or who wasn't successful. I mean, she'd already been covered in Vanity Fair as like the new it media person, right? Like it wasn't like she wasn't someone who people took seriously. She was someone who was serious, who was leaving because she didn't believe in the direction it was going in, and that was a very powerful thing for her to do.
I agree completely. So Barry Weiss or Elon Musk?
I think they were different things. I think for people inside of media, what Barry did, like just it opened up the gates for people to say. And again, like this is when Substack was there saying, hey, we will take anyone who basically Substack was also that thesis too, where it was like, hey, like the person who is not welcome inside of an organization can write for us and can write for their audience. But then I think what Elon did as Elon opened up the institutional sense, like he exposed censorship at the institutional level and made it possible for everyday people to speak on that platform. And I think X has had an extraordinary impact. X is the reason why the election went the way that it did. X is the reason why we're able to have this conversation the way we're having it now.
And it's the reason that I think the grooming or rape scandal in the UK was exposed, and Elon deserves a huge amount of credit for that. Although I think people are upset around Europe that he's quote unquote interfering in politics. Although I don't agree with that. I think billionaires have interfered in politics all around the world for a long time. He just gets exposed for it. So
I think
next,
people are ashamed. I agree with you. I think people are ashamed, and the reason they are upset is because he is publicly shaming them over something they should be ashamed of.
completely agree. Okay, next rapid fire question: community notes or human editors?
Oh, community notes. Like, and this is a great day to be having the question, right? Like it is so much fun. I actually think it is really fun to be on X now and to see how the community is policing itself. And some of the community notes are just hilarious, right? Like human editors aren't allowed to be funny. They're like the least fun people in society. But the community notes are oftentimes hilarious. And so always bet on the thing that's going to be funnier.
So will the Free Press introduce community notes? I mean,
You
you're
know,
on the
I
board.
Well, so what I love, I mean, I always read the comments in the Free Press. They're so smart and people are so astute. and care a lot about that community. And so I think the comment section of all of the articles is valuable. Like, you should read the article. I used to say as a reporter, I would never read the comments because they were just so hateful. But everything I've written for the Free Press, I take the comments very seriously, and there's a lot of things I've learned from them.
Okay, what is the most surprising technological innovation of 2024 to you? Was it the SpaceX toothpicks, the Anduril operating system, or the beepers and pagers that blew up
Gosh,
in Lebanon?
so the beepers and the pagers is definitely the most like, that was definitely the biggest surprise, right? Like, that is like a shocking, incredible story of innovation, and an incredible story of government innovation too, right? Because, like, but what's interesting about the options you gave me is that, the first two you mentioned, those are private companies, that, in some ways, like, I'm never surprised that Anduril is capable of doing incredible things, or I'm never really surprised. Like, did I think that SpaceX wasn't going to be able to maneuver the chopsticks in the way that they did? Like, in some ways, I'm not surprised, right? But you asked surprising. And I think, like, there's just hands down, but also surprising that a government is capable of that, right? Like, I don't think that's just it. That's part of the most extraordinary thing, is that a government is capable of, of that kind of innovation, of that kind of secrecy, of that kind of execution. It's extraordinary.
And what's the most meaningful innovation you think of the last year?
The last year, um, to go back to our transhumanism point, I actually, I'll change your question a little bit, but I think 2023 is when you had ChatGPT and Ozempic come on the main stage, and that's transhumanism of the digital world and transhumanism of the physical world. And, to me, what's really, really interesting about those two innovations is that, at least most Americans are much more comfortable with the transhumanism of the physical kind. Like, people, like, no one looks at Ozempic and says, "Oh, that's a bad thing that you can lose 25 pounds with a shot, or however much weight you need to lose with the shot." But people are much more skeptical of AI. At least, from, I think young people, maybe there's a little bit of a difference, but, like, the average person is a little bit more fearful of the digital transhumanism than the physical transhumanism. And so I think it'll be interesting to see which one of those innovations has the bigger impact. I would argue the digital transhumanism is, and we've only begun to scratch the surface of where artificial intelligence is going in our daily life. But it is interesting that those two radical changes have, happened at the same time in the same year, and really have extraordinary scale as two companies.
I'll make a comment that I probably shouldn't make, but I think that Ozempic is interesting in that it, as a religious person, it takes away the need to control myself, because I don't need to control myself for a long, long, long time, and then I get a shot, and woof, it kind of goes away. And I worry about that in general, things that erase things that the human body and brain and psyche has gotten used to.
Yeah. Well, I think the most interesting part about Ozempic that is probably under discussed is it affects all sort of risk taking. So it's,
Interesting.
it's impulse control across not just eating, but, there's reports about, vice consumption or alcohol consumption, but also appetite for risk. And so if you have an entire community of people, whether it's Hollywood or whether it's Silicon Valley, and they're all doing Ozempic, does that change the appetite for risk? So much of what we do is assessing risk. So I think there'll be more sort of meditations and studies on that aspect of it, in the future.
Is it a fair due diligence question to ask somebody, do you take Ozempic?
Well, I think maybe it should be. If we find out that it really does affect someone's appetite for risk, or affect someone's appetite for certain impulses, it's probably something we should know, and there shouldn't be as much shame about it too. I mean, I think, in some ways people should be very honest about the ways that they're controlling their bodies, and, if we're using artificial intelligence for certain types of reports or writing, we should be honest about that as well too.
I want to thank Katherine for doing this. This was superb. For those of you still listening, this is going to be the longest podcast I ever did, because it is incredibly interesting to talk to Katherine. So much both in common, and so many interesting pieces of tidbits of information and insight. And if you want to learn more about Katherine, you can follow her on X, and that is at KTM Boyle, KTM Boyle. Katherine, thank you so much for doing this. And if you're still listening, please rate us 5 stars on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to us, and on YouTube, and join our community on YouTube. Katherine, thank you so much for joining Invested. I really, really appreciate it and enjoyed it immensely.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much again for having me.